Once again, a warm welcome to those joining us today. Hopefully this is a fantastic start to the week. On behalf of the Keep Britain Working team, we really hope you enjoy the next hour as we discuss the economic fight back and the 5 ideas to keep Britain working. I'm Jennifer May, I'm the Customer Experience Officer for the Reed Group and one of the co-founders of the Keep Britain Working campaign. I'll be your host today and we'll introduce our guests very shortly. So some housekeeping just before we start. We will have some time for questions at the end, so please do write those into the chat function, which is just on the right hand side. And when you submit them, if you could just share who you'd like to direct the question to, then I'll make sure that we ask the person the question that you'd like to hear the answer from. The ideas that we're going to share today have been crowdsourced through the campaign and then developed by our speakers. If you'd like to expand on these thoughts as we're talking, we'd really love to get your inputs. So either post them in the chat or get in touch with us post the webinar. You can get in touch with us directly at keepbritainworking@reed.com. We're really looking forward to adapting our thinking to make this as useful as possible. If anyone has any tech issues at all during the webinar, please don't worry. We're recording the webinar and it'll be available later on this week. And finally, the structure for today will be a Q&A. It'll be a Q&A discussion with our panel, which will last for about 30 minutes, and then we'll have a bit of time for questions at the end. So just before we introduce our guests, I'm going to spend a couple of minutes outlining the Keep Britain Working campaign. And many of you will know this already, but the campaign has a very simple objective. It's to preserve jobs and protect livelihoods. The key functions of this campaign are to share, connect and inspire. When we say share, we mean sharing ideas like we're doing today, sharing information and encouraging pledges and commitments from companies to do as much as they can to keep the economy moving. And by connecting, it's about connecting people and employers to each other and connecting businesses to each other. And finally, by inspiring, it's about inspiring change. And today is a great example of us doing that by discussing the 5 ideas to keep Britain working. And we hope that you'll find some of the content in here inspiring and useful for you. So far for the campaign, we have hundreds of key supporters and important business figures across the UK, including James Timpson, the CEO of Timpson, Jed Mason, who's joining us today from the Mawson Group, Liv Garfield, CEO of Severn Trent, PwC, the CBI, REC, and many more. We have a number of followers on Twitter with millions of impressions now on our social channels. We use the hashtag Keep Britain Working, so if you're sharing anything and you want to involve us, please do use the hashtag Keep Britain Working. We're working with companies daily who are making fantastic commitments and supporting them to redeploy people at this really challenging time. If you need any support from us, please do get in touch. Again, it's the same email address, keepbritainworking@reed.com. So as you'll see on the screen, there's 3 ways that you can get involved right now. You can share an idea, you can make a pledge, or you can sign up for your support. So the topic we're discussing today, the economic fight back and 5 ideas to keep Britain working, as mentioned, have been developed throughout the campaign and then further developed by James, Neil and Jed, who are joining us today. Our speakers today are passionate about thinking forward, and I'm sure many people on the call are too. Our collective belief is that we have a number of learnings now and some lived experiences through the last few months of the health and subsequent economic crisis. And we really see today as an opportunity to take these learnings and ideas forward and develop them into focus areas for change. So as shared, finally, please do share your ideas as we go through. And that's enough from me. I'm really pleased to welcome our 3 guest speakers. So I'd like to start by welcoming Neil Carberry, the CEO of the REC. Welcome, Neil.
Hello, good afternoon. Delighted to join you.
Thank you, Neil. Welcome. Welcome also to Jed Mason, the CEO of the Mawson Group. Welcome, Jed.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for all coming on board.
Thanks, Jed. And finally, welcome to James Reed, the CEO of Reed. Welcome, James.
Hello, Jennifer, and hello, Jed and Neil, and welcome everyone to this discussion.
Great. So without further ado, let's get started. I'm going to ask the first question to James and Neil, starting with James. So James, the ideas we'll discuss today came about through the Keep Britain Working campaign and conversation between the panel. What triggered you to start talking about these ideas?
Well, Jennifer, as you said, a lot of people have been submitting ideas to the campaign since it was set up on the 20th of April. And a number of these ideas were about national insurance. So I thought this was an area worth exploring. And it seems to me that over the past 20, 30 years even, the rate for national insurance, both for workers and for employers, has consistently gone up. And this is effectively a tax on jobs. And that's fine when there are lots of jobs and more people going into jobs, but it's more questionable as an economic strategy when more people are becoming unemployed, as they are now, and jobs are harder to come by. So I thought it was a good observation from the people who submitted those ideas that something should be done about national insurance. And it's currently at the level of 13.8% for employers, which is a significant tax on employing people. But also for employees, they pay national insurance too, and a lot of lower paid workers are paying a proportionately significant amount. And I think the burden of national insurance, where possible, should be lifted, but it should certainly be lifted from low paid workers.
I think it's a really interesting point, and very interesting. It's come up a number of times throughout the campaign as well. Neil, do you have any thoughts about this and whether the insurance reform could make a real difference?
So I think James's observation is the right one, and I think people don't quite understand the scale of national insurance as a tax. Let's start with the fact that NI is 109 years old this year. It was introduced by David Lloyd George to fund the state pension, and we still have stuck in our head this idea that NI is in some way contributory, but we all know it isn't really. It's just another form of income tax. It's one paid by low-paid workers when income tax itself largely is paid much less now because of changes made over the last few years by low-paid workers, and it's also and this isn't often covered in the debate, it's the biggest single business tax. So in the last few years, what we've had is a debate about business tax that focuses on talking about cutting tax on profits and corporation tax, but actually maintaining and indeed increasing taxes on activity like employers' national insurance. Now, as James said, in the good times, you can probably get away with that. But right now, there's an opportunity as we come through the crisis to think about the balance between those two, because really, we don't want to be making employing people more expensive or keeping it as expensive as it is now in an environment where we're desperately trying to get people back into work as we go through this over the next few months.
Mm-hmm. Yes, really interesting. Thanks, Neil.
Can I add there something, Jennifer? For the worker, the national employment rate drops, and I've got it here. It drops to 2% above £962 per week. So for the higher paid worker, there's a lot. Proportionally, they're paying less, and I think it could be flipped so that the national insurance is paid by people who are above median wage, typically, not below it. So it's not just the headline rates that should be reviewed, but the way the whole thing works, I think.
Mm-hmm. I think that's an important point to add. I think we'll come on to talk about lower paid workers and the impact in a moment too. Thank you both for that. Jed, I imagine Mawson are agile and entrepreneurial. How important is creative thinking and ideas to your business right now?
I guess in this new world we're all operating, we have to encourage creative thinking, obviously being entrepreneurial, and what kind of got us here won't keep us here. So creative thinking at all levels in our business, as I'm sure everyone is at this moment in time, is being promoted and encouraged to stand up and speak, because, you know, in all fairness, us as leaders, we don't profess to know everything, and COVID has brought new ways of working, and the drive to be flexible and change is important. I think first steps of encouraging working right now is really getting the think tanks going again. I believe when we are in an office environment, the benefits of that think tank and feeding off each other is the first steps, really. So getting back to work is important to allow those think tanks really to look at the creative ways and new ways of working and ideas for improving the creativity for our evolving needs of what our clients, customers are looking for now.
Yeah, great, thank you, Jed. And Neil, before we move on to the second idea, I just had a question for you. So as the CEO of the REC, why is collaborating with companies in this moment of need so important now? And have you been working with any other companies to stimulate and share ideas across industry?
So for those on the webinar who don't know the REC is one of Britain's biggest business organisations. We've got 3,300 members, of which I'm glad to say both Reed and Mawson are members, representing Britain's recruitment and staffing industry. We also have an individual professional membership of over 10,000 professionals working in recruitment and staffing. And because of that, our job is really to look out for our sector, but not primarily just so we can have a successful sector. It's because the industry does get Britain working. It makes great work happen across the whole UK, helps companies to grow, and helps people find new opportunities. So for us, we feel we've got a really big stake in how Britain comes out of where we are now, and that stake is driven by not just pointing out to government where they're wrong, but being willing to stand up with the things that government might be able to do. Not just small things, but big ideas. You saw that debate over the weekend about changing the shape of government. If you were reading your Sunday papers, I think that that's a real opportunity to say to government, look, you guys who are mostly being kind to them deeply bright, but mostly have worked a political career, maybe a bit of time in the law or in the city, you need to work with us who've spent our years at the coalface of the modern economy to understand what the real practical challenges are and how the policies you're coming up with, which are great in terms of direction, can really be made to make a difference for people. Because what we've had over the last few months is a shutdown in the economy driven by the need to lock down, and what we really need to bust through is making sure that doesn't affect demand, whether that's business investment or it's consumer demand for the long term. The best way of doing that is getting ideas running that help the economy pick up pace quickly through the third and fourth quarter of 2020. That's why when James and I started discussing this, and Jed, the 5 ideas seemed like a really great idea, and it builds on work we've been doing at the REC, bringing businesses together. We've talked to every one of our 3,300 members within the last couple of months about the position of their business and what would help, and that's now transitioning from how we help you get through the lockdown to how we build back.
Yeah, there's a lot of considerations and definitely a role for everyone to play in the UK. So the first idea to reform national insurance, but before we move on to the second idea, James, you mentioned the impact on lower paid workers and entry-level jobs, and we've talked with you in separate webinars about the concern for the most impacted groups as a result of COVID. Do you think this reform will do enough for lower paid workers?
Well, I think that employment and regrettably unemployment will be the big issue for the next 6 months as the economy emerges from lockdown, and I think it rightly should be focused on. But I think the lower paid workers should be given most attention because they're the most vulnerable typically, and we've seen that already in terms of the number of people who've lost their jobs and the sectors that they're from. So I think it's really important that we focus on that group, especially as we emerge. And the 5 ideas we're talking about this afternoon really do that, and each in their different way has a bearing on that group. But I think it's critical that the policy focus is on the lowest paid. And that we transition as many people back into work as quickly as possible, and that we develop an economy that's high productivity, high wage, but that will have to happen over time.
Thanks, James. And Jed, do you have any thoughts on this?
I agree with some of the tax reforms on NI is an obvious one that will help employers as well as employees and retaining jobs. I think, as Neil said, we've had decades of sort of piecemeal add-ons to the NI, and is it a case of a wider tax policy would be a common sense prevail on that. The only thing I have is the timetable under which these things need to get underway. In between that, I know NI is a great idea to look at, but what about the job retention scheme, which we've currently got? Could that be extended? Conscious of what the government's announcements are on spend, we've got a cliff edge happening, and the announcements really does cater for the sectors in infrastructure. But I guess, you know, there's a lot of people maybe on this call who are in retail and leisure and other sectors that equally need help. So I think the job retention should be, as well as NI, be a push for us all collectively to sort of look at. I think those sectors of retail, leisure, are going to need more of a phase in and carry on. And I think the government should be looking at different sectors by sector in terms of the furlough and job retention scheme. But yeah, NI is definitely one. I think James's points are well placed.
Great, thanks, Jed. So moving on to the second idea, but this one's particularly focused on the topic of skills gaps, which we know was a challenge before the pandemic. Yet we believe this problem will be accelerated with up to 5 million redundant, with likely further acceleration of need for digital skills, particularly due to the faster adaptation as we move to a world that is far more reliant on digital. So the second idea is about unleashing apprenticeships and training. James, could you elaborate on this?
Yes, well, I think apprenticeships are incredibly important, and the whole infrastructure of apprenticeships was changed back in 2016-17. And I'm certain that the intentions were good, but unfortunately the consequences have not been what was intended, in that there are now significantly fewer number of people, especially young people, doing apprenticeships than there were then. So, you know, the government introduced an apprenticeship levy on larger employers, which many see or saw as a tax, and then put in a system in place where you could reclaim it to pay for apprentices. That system is, I think, complex, and it puts off a lot of employers, some of whom are now spending less as a result. And I think it's something that we should urgently reform, because it's an excellent way into the workplace, especially for young people, and it's a very good alternative to university. And there was talk at the weekend, the Prime Minister talked about opportunities, a guarantee of opportunity for everyone. So I'm hopeful that this will be revisited, but it needs to be made easier to access for companies, and easier to make relevant to their businesses, so that many more people can avail themselves of it. So I think apprenticeships are incredibly important. They're a very important part of this economic fight back, and it's an opportunity now to really rethink.
Great, thanks, James. And Jed, I wonder if you see this skills challenge across the clients that you're working with.
Yeah, undoubtedly there is skills challenges still. I don't think it's changed from what was pre-COVID. A number of sectors have had the ageing population coming to the cliff edge of retirement. So, you know, definitely in infrastructure, I think over the years the element of blue collar or skilled trades has not necessarily had the view that people want to pursue those as career options. But now I think with the 5 million possible numbers that we're highlighting, it's now more than ever that we try and cross-sell some of the skills into training. So for me, apprenticeships have always been vital. They're a bloodline, and I think every company's been taking advantage of the levy. But it is another tax burden, stealth tax in a way. I think opening that up to agency workers as well is paramount to allow crossover from areas of sectors that are going to be obviously impacted by employment, that we can then cross-train them and move them into other areas. So definitely, I think we should be looking at the wider incentives, and a bit like research and development. Why don't we use it as an offset for tax? Mm-hmm. Needs to be worked easier, but yeah, there's a definite demand in all the sectors. But as we've seen aerospace market drop off, there is skills in the aerospace market that could adapt with training into the areas of nuclear new build or the railway environment. So it's important that we do use some of this investment for apprenticeships to continue, but also for retraining.
Great, and I know that you're seeing this firsthand in those spaces as well. Neil, do you have anything to add here?
Thanks. I think this question of apprenticeships is really important because James and Jed are right. Apprenticeships are absolutely vital, but we need to decide what an apprenticeship is. An apprenticeship is a route to a skilled career for a young person, and we should support them with that in mind. The challenge that we've had for years is governments essentially thinking there's one answer to all of this. So you do all your training by an apprenticeship. Well, that looks out, as Jed said, agency temps, and we make that decision from Whitehall. What I'd really like to see in this is using the funding frameworks that we put in place to say, yes, we're going to expect businesses to step up and provide apprenticeships for young people, but we're also acknowledging that there's retraining to do of older workers, and that there will be other forms of shorter training that are needed, for instance, for agency temps, and making all of that more fundable, and then linking it really closely to local skills plans and provision that's being put together by LEPs and colleges. We just make it all work more smoothly. We've got to get the decision making on this much closer to the people that matter, and acknowledge that the customer of the system isn't government, who's currently the paymaster, it's the learner and the company who will employ the learner. And if we can get those voices more loud in the system at a local level, funded centrally, that will make all the difference.
Yeah.
Neil, you mentioned to me there were some interesting examples in other countries. Is it worth just calling out a couple?
Well, the most obvious examples, James, to look at, because in a spirit of you can't always get what you want, I think some form of levy for paying for training is probably going to be with us for the long haul. The issue is actually not the levy, it's whether the levy works. I think most British businesses would bite government's hand off for a skills system that worked if it cost 0.5% of payroll. The challenge is at the moment it doesn't work and it still costs 0.5% of payroll. France and Singapore both have systems where if companies are doing the right thing for them already, that there is an allowance made in their levy payment. So if you've got your own skills plan that is deemed to be up to standard, then your levy is adjusted. Other systems around the world say you must spend this much on apprenticeships, and we'll let you spend the rest on whatever you want. So there are systems with flexibility that have been proven in a levy environment to increase training, unlike this one, which I'm afraid was always going to decrease training. And I was talking with Seamus Nevin last week, who was my opposite number at the IOD when I was at the CBI working on this back in 2015 and 2016. And we both feel like Cassandra on this, because everything that's played out on the apprenticeship levy over the last 5 years is precisely what businesses told government would happen. And maybe the opportunity of this crisis is that government gets the fact that that business advice is rooted in real practicality now.
Is it a case of, James, I think you quoted some numbers, in terms of the apprentice effectiveness, is it dropped? Oh.
Well, yeah, I was looking at the statistics earlier. So in the academic year 2016 to 17, 495,000 apprenticeship starts in England. And last year, 2018-19, there were 393,000 apprenticeship starts. So, that's down 100,000. And then the beginning of this year, there's been a further drop this academic year, before the COVID thing, really. And the biggest fall, 15%, is amongst apprentices aged 16 to 19. So that seems a real shame. And those are precisely the people we should be trying to engage.
Something's not working then.
No, it's not working. And I think it was well intentioned, but it needs to be rethought. And I think Neil's made some very good points.
Yeah. Great. So thank you, James. Thank you, Neil, and Jed. Some good examples in there. Neil, the third idea is to develop smarter employment law by reforming the application of the European directives to better suit the UK labour market post-Brexit, including the Agency Workers Directive. This speaks to some of the challenges and deterrents that businesses face. Can you share some more about this, and specifically, if you can, draw out which groups you think would benefit from this the most?
So James has already made clear the people who lose out most in a labour market downturn are those who, with the lowest skills, who are in the most marginal positions generally. And this one's particularly tough because the sectors that are being hit hardest, if you look at hospitality and retail, are traditionally the sectors that offer people a way into the labour market. And that's a particular challenge. I remember once a former chief executive of Sainsbury's saying to me, it doesn't matter how many times the government has a cabinet meeting at Rolls-Royce, most people work for us in Tesco. And there's a grain of truth in that. Those big retailers and hospitality firms employ a lot of people. That's why we've seen furlough numbers that are as high as they are. Now, it's important when you talk about employment law that you acknowledge that you've got to have a strong base floor of rights, but that floor of rights has to be smart. And we've learned a lot over the lockdown as to how we can make things smarter. So sometimes that involves increasing the standards. We're really keen, for instance, to see some of these new app-based businesses who are pretending that they're not employment agencies be properly regulated as employment agencies, like Jed and James are. But equally, we've learned to do things quicker. So one of the big things REC managed to do for employment agencies during the lockdown was get right to work checks and criminal records checks fully online. We're really keen now that we don't go back to the system that we had before. If you look at employment law as a whole, there's a whole load of things, particularly in the European directives, where we've gold-plated what is a reasonable aim and made the process more cumbersome for firms, and particularly where you've got small businesses. You're going to have a lot of startups over the next few years looking at becoming an employer for the first time. Things like the record keeping requirements in the Working Time Directive, things like the specificity of the equal treatment rules in the Agency Workers Directive, where you don't just have to roughly treat people equally, you have to specifically mirror everything that you offer and offer it after the qualifying period. So there's a whole slew of stuff where we could just have an even-handed look and remove some of that process while maintaining the outcomes that would encourage more businesses to become employers for the first time as they start up and grow, and then to build on that and grow more of a workforce as they see the demand return.
Great, thanks, Neil. James, I know that you have some additional thoughts on this.
Yeah, well, these are two things that have been mentioned to me. I mean, on the agency workers regulations, it specifies currently that this precise parity should occur after 13 weeks, which isn't very long. You know, you're making temporary workers, putting them on the same basis as people who might have been there 20 or 30 years. So I think that should be specifically looked at, and it's not to say parity shouldn't occur at some point. I think perhaps, probably it should, but maybe after a year or longer. And I know this was a big subject of debate at the time these regulations were introduced, but I am aware of some employers who are just rotating temporary workers so they don't have to pay more at 13 weeks, which is a shame for someone who's been there for 12, but they might not have a job the following week. So I think that could be improved in everyone's interest, and to give more people access to work. The other chestnut is severance pay. We read with outrage in the press about public officials who've been asked to leave and then go off with a handsome paycheck from whatever taxpayer-funded organisation it is, and the same applies across businesses. And an unintended consequence of this is it's more expensive for employers, whether they're in the public or private sector, to fire people who are highly paid. And a consequence of that is more lower paid people get fired as a result if they have to save money. Well, that's my theory. So I have the idea that all severance pay should be capped at 3 months' notice, which seems fair, and I think would make it more attractive to employ people at all levels in business, because you know what the exit cost is. I don't know what the others think. They might think that's an outrageous suggestion, but it seems fair to me, and I think it would help employers hold on to and hire more low-paid people.
Yeah, I think
I agree with your severance. Why not go a stage further like we've done in rugby, which is salary caps? I think the Agency Workers Directive definitely needs to be looked at, a fresh look, because it needs to be really that suits the UK economy, our economy. So yeah, looking at working time and practices really that suits us, the flexibility, and combined with reviewing the Taylor report, and leads on to the IR35, which we've not touched on. As I know it's been a government delay, but the IR35 still is for me, it's something that needs to be thrashed out better. We're missing a little trick of losing some of this flexible workforce that's made us competitive in the UK versus our counterparts in Europe. And I think entrepreneurial spirit that we encourage with the IR35 is going to be dampened. So there's lots to do on Agency Workers Directive, and I agree some of the points you raised there, James.
Great, thanks, Jed. So James, I think you've got some support for your idea there.
Can we ask Neil about the IR35?
Sure.
Jed just mentioned. What's the REC doing?
So when IR35 was first delayed by Philip Hammond, if you remember him, back at the end of 2018, it was delayed to April 2020 from April 2019 in the private sector. We said then that this is an opportunity to look properly at the taxation treatment of people who work in ways other than being open-ended, fully employed workers. Nothing really happened with regard to that, because we had a really big challenge in terms of Brexit, another of the greatest hits of British politics in the last 5 years, and now we've got COVID. I think IR35 needs to be filed under the idea that Jed put up earlier, which is we need a proper look at how we tax work, and we need to acknowledge that people do not or will not all be working in the way our fathers and grandfathers worked, with most people employed for a long time on an employment contract by a single firm. So and that needs to be fair. People should pay the right amount of tax, but it requires more than just tweaks like IR35. So the pressure that we're putting onto government is, don't blow away this opportunity to have a proper look at tax. In the same way, we're talking about employment rights, in the same way as actually we should sit down and we should absolutely get the trade unions in and other voices and talk about, well, what does a good and efficient floor of employment rights that encourages economic growth look like for Britain and in a British context, post-Brexit, post-COVID?
Mm-hmm. Adapting to the new world around us, I think, is a really important point and a real running thread of this conversation. So the fourth idea is about investing in infrastructure. James, did you want to just summarise this, and then I'll hand over to Jed and Neil for some more thoughts.
Well, pleasingly, this seems to have been picked up, and the announcements at the weekend, I don't think we can take the credit for it, but is that there is going to be a lot more investment in infrastructure, and that's going to be accelerated, which is one of the ideas of the 5. I would say that all of our experience over the last few months would suggest that broadband should be right at the top of the list, because particularly people in rural areas that are not well served with broadband will have found it a lot more difficult to work like this than had they been. So I think there's also announcements regarding those 40 hospitals that they're going to be accelerated, and I think that's all very welcome, because these are necessary investments in the economic infrastructure of a country, but also they create jobs. But the broadband one, I think, is even more pressing now than perhaps it was a few months ago.
I'm sure many across the UK have felt the sometimes pain of that. Jed, I know that you recruit across the sectors that may support infrastructure change, so just wondered if you had any points to add there.
Yeah, before I do, I live in just outside Knutsford, and believe it or not, I can't get a phone line on my mobile. So I agree with James. That's a number 1 on my list, James. Yeah, in terms of the infrastructure, I think it's fair to say the government, we have been lobbying and they have listened. James sort of highlighted this need to spend. Guess not since the last war when the Chancellor then went on a spending spree and obviously was keen to build, but we've got to make sure it's jobs. We've got, the infrastructure, why is that focus? Because I guess there's a number of people saying, well, what about this sector and, the leisure, hospitality? And I think this is a once in an opportunity of a time where we can put a stamp on for our future generations in terms of the Victorian sort of infrastructure we have had on the roads and highways and rail. If you look at our, again, counterparts in other countries around the world, they've invested heavily and reaped the benefits. And HS2, well, there's pluses and minuses, and my view is it opens up jobs to being able to open up areas and living and quality of life, accessibility. So I'm all for the infrastructure, not from a selfish point of view, if that's the sweet spots for us as an organisation, many others. I think job creation in this environment will allow disposable income to allow us to spend on other areas that like those that have not been immediately affected by it, but will benefit in terms of disposable income. So, yeah, we've got to undertake this. I think Thatcher did it as well. Fiscal policy. Yes, it might in future mean tax rises to pay for all this, but I think we've got to do this to kickstart. Otherwise, we'll just be a spiral and we won't have seen a recession like it. So it's the right thing to do, infrastructure spend, and then making sure we have the jobs it truly creates in hospitals. So yeah, I'm all for it.
And if we did start to do more in terms of investing in infrastructure change, how do you think social distancing could impact the ability to do that?
In terms now, yeah, gladly gone down to 1 metre, and I'm going to say gladly on not the basis of safety being lost. I think obviously we've got people in the government to make sure that that's a safe distancing. Yeah, we've had challenges ourselves in our infrastructure programmes, particularly on construction sites, but now obviously the fit for purpose and been assessed, as you would expect, to allow workers back. Some areas of confined working spaces, whether it's on the underground or on submarine defence programmes, we've had to ensure, again, it's been a bit slower and restrictive. So yeah, it does have an impact on programmes, and so hopefully, fingers crossed, we don't have a second wave and we can start to claw that back. Social distancing is important.
Thanks, Jed. And Neil, you've spoken briefly about investing in infrastructure. Is there anything that you wanted to add here?
Well, I think that what's clear is this is actually one of the areas that's best supported by evidence. We know that infrastructure spend has a big multiplier effect on the local economy, and actually the multiplier is often bigger than you expect. I'll give you a small example from my part of the world. The Scottish Government rebuilt the Borders Railway up from the Borders into Edinburgh over 10 years until about 5 years ago. And that is returning twice what they expected. The last time I was there trying to get a train up to Edinburgh from Tweedbank, I couldn't get a seat on the train. It's been so successful. And we know that people change behaviour around the infrastructure that they have, and that's why it has a big multiplier. And HS2 is absolutely vital. But it's not just the big projects, it's the small projects, it's better links between towns. If you look at Manchester, where Jed is, you've got a satellite of towns around Manchester, which are actually economically having more challenging times than Manchester and Salford are themselves. Improving the infrastructure between those towns and between those towns and central Manchester again works, and broadband is critical. I always remember the chief exec of Yeo Valley, great company, buy your yogurts from Yeo Valley, Carl Tucker, saying that he regarded the southwest of England, where they're based, as the UK's quiet carriage, and it is. You go down there and there's no mobile phone signal, and the broadband is terrible. But look at where we've all been for the last 3 months working from home. If we invested in broadband, why wouldn't you want to hire someone in Anglesey to do a job, or someone in Cornwall, or someone in the Lake District? And just speaking on my kind of experience as a low pay commissioner looking at setting the minimum wage, I think some of the examples of poverty in Britain are worse in our rural areas than they are in some of our towns and cities, but we don't pick up on it because it's a pretty place to be. And the more we can do to link those parts of the country into the rest of our economy, the better for the people that live there.
Yeah, absolutely. It could absolutely change the way that we think about the world of work too.
Jenny, if I may add, and sorry to interrupt, in terms of the social distancing, and I think whilst we talk about infrastructure, a lot of people maybe in the recruitment world and office environments as well, is to how do we get people back to work, and that's what we're trying to promote as well. And I guess there's a resistance and hesitance around coming back in is it safe, and there's a fear factor, and I understand that people's concerns. So what we've got to do is try and help to smooth that as best we can, and I think it's all down to good communications, undertaking surveys and questionnaires with your staff as to what they're expecting, and trying to find what areas they might want to see in the operating world. We've done some fly-throughs of the buildings so that people get confidence who've not been into the office to see what's been done and invested in. It's quite a good video in terms of equipment we've bought in, heat detectors, contactless dispensers, etc., etc. So if anyone does want to have a look at our fly-through, more than happy to share, because I think there is going to be a wave of how do we get people back to work, and how do we overcome their concerns. So be flexible about that as well.
Yeah, thanks, Jed. So that concludes the discussion on the fourth idea, investing in infrastructure. Obviously, there are other yogurt companies available, but as we move on to the fifth idea, Neil, the fifth idea is about expanding research and development, which in some ways is closely connected to the skills challenge we face. We know that innovation often accelerates in moments like this. So can you unpack your thinking on this idea?
Thanks, Jen. I think if you look at R&D, we tend to think a lot about research, and we know British research is fantastic. Look at the work that's been done by the Oxford Group or the Imperial Group on the COVID vaccine. Genuinely world-leading stuff. Look at the work that was done in Manchester on graphene. Huge amount of really cutting-edge research happens here in the UK, and that's important, and we should acknowledge that our universities in particular are facing a tough time over the next couple of years, because that science base needs to be maintained. So I think that's a really important priority. But the other bit about science is it's great to make those cutting-edge discoveries, but actually what makes a difference to the economy is development and deployment. And we've got a less strong record as a country in deploying new technology and developing it. If you look at the benefits of graphene, that Manchester discovery, lots of them are actually happening outside the UK now. And the challenge for us is how we get through what this, and I apologise for the term, but this is actually the term that people use, get across the valley of death from scientists in university and company research labs into people's daily lives. And there's a lot that we can do there. If you look at the data on the UK economy on adoption of systems like employee enterprise planning, CRMs, actually the UK lagged behind in the last decade. Countries like Denmark on adopting new technology options. If we can speed that up, and I think the business campaign to do this is doing some great work, then we can make a real difference. I think the challenge is how we as a business community work with government and others to make sure we're investing in corporate leadership and management skills that can really run that development forward. There's a big debate to have about how we set up British industry to take advantage of some of this new technology, and I think what's really important is that we as a business community own the solutions there. We don't wait for government to tell us what to do, but what we do need from government is to protect the science base and the research side and give us the focus on development that allows us to start to focus on deployment.
It's interesting about the involvement of business. And Jed, I was going to ask you, because I know that you've recently developed an app called the Fit to Work app. This is a great example of accelerating innovation. Could you just explain a bit more about how you came to that idea and why you think it's important to focus on that?
Yes, I think R&D tax credits that are already available are pretty good, actually, and we've got to give credit to the government there in terms of R&D. It's not all about products either, it's services. So, you know, anything we can do to make ourselves efficient and improve our services. So yeah, I'd say to everyone to really look at the R&D. No, so more than now, you know, we're in the eye of a storm, and let the eye wander and see what creativeness we can use. Pre-COVID, we were looking at an app with Fit for Work. It was really around tracking. In its intention was around safety initially, around people working in remote workers in locations, which has now taken on board. It's gone into facial recognition. But the features really have expanded beyond that. We've got to look for adding on time and attendance, but more importantly to do with COVID, the health and well-being and wellness and COVID questions, checking against meds and briefings on health and safety. So this app, Fit for Work, is what we call it. Really benefits those type of working environments, and we're promoting that. So yeah, that's just one of the many projects we do on our in-house design work as well. But I do think R&D is important to push on. Balance with, I guess, whilst we're going into massive employment, how much of AI do we want to push? You know, we need to create jobs, and AI takes away jobs. But for me, AI needs to be an aid to working environments, not a replacement. Otherwise, we've got a vicious circle we're chasing.
Great, thanks, Jed. And just before we move on to questions that have been submitted by those people listening in today, so thank you for that in advance. Jed, we've talked about how the industry can support each other to survive and thrive at the moment. How do you think that we can raise awareness of key topics and ideas? I mean, we've talked a lot today about the need to work alongside the government and the need to work together, but is there anything else that you think we could be doing? Jed, I think you're on mute.
Sorry, apologies. Yeah, I think, you know, tentatively, we tend to leave our governing bodies to do the promoting and be the voice, but I think it's important we all sort of pull together now, and, you know, we think about writing to our MPs and government, that it goes on deaf ears. I can assure you, you know, certain things I've personally done at James and the REC, you can see the benefits, you can see the shape. You know, we were all involved in the House of Lords opportunity on IR35, and many businesses were quoted in there ourselves. So we do get listened to, and we must not just rely on our governing body. So the challenge to me is for everyone to really push, be vocal, be heard, not just rely on the likes of James and Neil. We're dealing with livelihoods here now, you know, people's futures are at stake. So let's be more vocal.
Yeah, absolutely. And in terms of some of the voices that we'll make sure are heard now, some questions have come through on the chat, so I'm just going to direct them to the people that have been requested to be directed to. So we've got a question here from Steve. This is directed to all. What does the panel think about job sharing, and would this be able to help people working and take advantage of the national insurance free pay?
If I could start, I think job sharing is a really good idea, and we've got several examples in our business where it works very successfully, but the people sharing the job need to be on the same page and agree how they're going to do it together. And I think it might be that we, for a period of time, work fewer hours. I mean, a lot of companies have adjusted their hours as a result of COVID, but it might be that, you know, to get more people working, it's appropriate that the average hours worked per head is slightly less, which would suggest sharing jobs is a way forward. And it might be that we work across 6 days of the week typically rather than 5, on a reduced hour basis, which would also help productivity. So I think there's a lot of scope for creativity here.
Can I just build on that?
Yeah.
So I think this is a really important point, and it links back to something James said earlier when we were talking about the Agency Workers Directive. I think job sharing in general is a fantastic idea, and as managers and leaders of businesses, we need to make sure more of it happens, because I think we do have a lot of workers who would be looking for a shorter working week. As a response to crisis, it might be important as a transitional phase. But what you wouldn't want for the long haul is a lot of people on very low wages for less than 16 hours or less a week. Because what you want to make sure is you get people escape velocity in the same way as you don't want people cycling through on 13-week cycles necessarily as agency workers. So I think it's a great idea where it works for the workers involved. As a response to an unemployment crisis, I think it has potential, but you need to ally it to that discussion we had about skills, because what you need to get is you need to get people escape velocity into higher productivity work that pays them better. Because the answer to if we're all going to work a bit less in the way that, for instance, the Germans do or the French do, then the answer to that is a higher productivity economy.
I agree. Job sharing is an option. You have to make sure all the continuity is there. It will open up another talent pool, particularly maybe in the area of people who are looking to retire, may wish to stay on, so you don't lose that intellectual IP. So yeah, job sharing, and also the younger generation coming through, if there's in that job sharing an ability to be transformed into the role. Just as I say, that things don't fall in the gaps, and the employers will need to manage that.
Thank you, Jed, and thank you, Steve, for that question. So the next question is from Jeremy in London, and it's about employment law, the reform. This is addressed to all. So there have been calls from some MPs for a movement towards a 4-day working week. What do you think of this proposal, and do you think it will help to keep Britain working?
Well, you go ahead, Jed. Go on.
I suppose I'm a little bit old-fashioned in my views on 4-day working, but I move with the times you've got to. You don't want to lose staff on the basis of that, so you have to be flexible. That said, in this moment in time, do we need, is it a case of we need the support of the workforce to be working extra to get us back? But equally, I guess the flexibility and maybe the options of costings for businesses, if 4 days a week helps on their finances, then yes, it should be looked at. So there's no right and wrong answer. It's what's best for the individuals and the business to make sure you don't lose staff as well.
It's interesting, in response to COVID, we've moved a lot of people onto a 4-day week, and now they want to go back to a 5-day week, understandably, because it was at a reduced weekly pay. So I think when it's sort of talked about in a political context, I think often the assumption is made that it's 4 days working for 5 days pay, but that's not necessarily what happens. So I think it's a question for individuals, really. Would they rather work a bit less but probably earn a bit less, or do they want to work longer and earn more? And that's a personal question that is determined individually, I would say. But it's good to have the flexibility, I think, in an organisation where you can do both.
I think that's right, James. And if I think about this 4-day week proposal, actually a 4-day week probably as a long-term goal for normalisation is plausible, in the way that once upon a time a 5-day week seemed implausible. But you need to be able to generate the income in 4 days that you currently generate in 5 days in order to afford to pay people 5 days pay for 4 days. That is not something government can impose. I worry about when people talk about this as an employment tool, because this is what we call in the economist field the lump of labour fallacy. It assumes that there's a certain amount of work to be done in the British labour market, and if we just slice the cake up differently, we can have a more equitable outcome. I would argue the opposite, which is that there's an infinite amount of work to be done as we search for new ways to serve each other as citizens, and the answer to growing the employment cake is more entrepreneurialism.
Mm-hmm. So interesting thoughts from everybody, and thank you for the question from Jeremy. So we've got time for one final question. This is from James, and it's directed to all, but we may have just the chance to hear from one or two. In November, Labour proposed the nationwide free broadband for all homes and businesses. Would you back a government-based system like this, and would you support nationalising the network? And I know we've spoken already a lot about broadband and the importance of that. So it's just if you have any further views on the execution method.
I'll give that a go if you want. Look, I'm not sure that the cost of broadband is necessarily the biggest challenge here. I think the availability of it is. And therefore, Openreach, you have responsibility for the network, as distinct from BT with a separate board, have a public service duty there. So I'd ask the government to focus in on challenging Openreach to get that delivered more quickly, and be willing to insert alternative providers if it's not happening, rather than making a big commitment with a huge deadweight cost. Because James and Jed and I are sitting here, and frankly, while it might be nice for government to pay our broadband bills at home, especially with the amount my kids are watching Netflix at the moment, it's not what I want taxpayers' money funding at a time when public finances are tight. So let's focus on the delivery, getting the network sorted, rather than the consumer offer.
Great, thanks, Neil. And I think that's all we'll have time for in terms of the responses. So thanks for that question too. So this concludes our discussion. Thank you to our participants for your fantastic input. As mentioned, the webinar has been recorded, so it will be available within the next 48 hours. You'll be able to listen again or share that if you think it will be useful for others. We've covered a lot of topics today, everything from looking at the role that businesses need to play to work alongside government, to share ideas and to keep Britain working. We've talked about the impact on the lower paid and how we should think differently about the way that we look at our tax and insurance and the way that we set up the construct of work around us. We've talked about the skills gap, which is a challenge that it feels like a lot of sectors are feeling at the moment. We've talked about the need to rethink employment, and we've talked about the need to focus on research and development, and all wrapped into this idea that we need to continue to use our voice. And I hope that today has been helpful and insightful for those who have joined. We will be doing more webinars like this. This is now the third. We've got more coming. Please do sign up to the campaign at keepbritainworking@read.com. If you would like to see more information, you can visit the keepbritainworking.com website too. So thank you again to Jed, thank you Neil, and thank you James. Thank you all for listening, and we hope to see you soon.
Thank you all.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you everyone. Keep safe and well.
Thanks, Jed.